Today we're going to discuss the social construction of race and gender, using Indigenous North America as an example of life before these constructions and the devastating impact that they have had. Society today is all about the othering of people, with a constant comparison of us versus them. But what about when they're just not like us? Why do we feel the need to judge, define, and often treat people differently based on how we see them in comparison to us or to the social norm? This is because race and gender have been constructed or imagined by society. Race has no biological or genetic basis. To explore this, let's go back and investigate the lives and practices of North American Indigenous communities. The Western colonial approach to gender is binary. There is male and female, but many Indigenous cultures across Turtle Island have a very different approach. The essence or spirit of a person was what defined them, not a gender. There were people who were not seen as male or female, but rather as a two-spirited alternative gender. Two-spirit refers to Native Americans who are born with both masculine and feminine spirits in one body. Moreover, two-spirit individuals were traditionally viewed as gifted and spiritual people who were highly respected. Early colonizers were outraged at the sexual ambiguity of the two-spirited peoples, as they did not fit into the Christian gender binary roles and therefore were a threat to the colonizers' Christianity. Now, on to race. Traditionally, there are many accounts of Aboriginal tribes and communities taking in sick or stranded explorers and healing, protecting, and including them in their daily lives. So why does one group include and one group exclude? How can an idea like race and racism be inherent if it's not prevalent in all cultures? Well, that's where social construction comes in. The state of nature, the state that is aligned with Indigenous culture, has been defined and interpreted by various philosophers. For Hobbes, the state of nature is characterized by the war of every man against every man, where the lives of man are solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. According to Locke, however, the state of nature is peaceful, and all mankind are equal and independent. No one ought to harm another in his life, liberty, or possessions. Locke's definition is much more aligned with the reality of Indigenous culture, where all people were treated equally and valued based on their spirit as a person and their contributions to the community. It was actually the colonial society that brought forth the nasty, brutish, warlike conditions described by Hobbes. Need proof? Let's take a look at a quote from Captain Richard Pratt.
"The only good Indian is a dead one, and that high sanction of his destruction has been an enormous factor in promoting Indian massacres. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man."
This idea formed the basis of residential schools, where the two primary objectives were to remove and isolate children from the influence of their homes, families, traditions, and cultures, and to assimilate them into the dominant culture. These objectives were based upon the assumption that Aboriginal cultures and spiritual beliefs were inferior and unequal. Indeed, some thought to kill the Indian in the child. The children were forbidden to speak their language or practice their culture and were forced to practice the religion of the school and were physically, emotionally, and sexually abused. Over 150,000 children were subjected to this cultural genocide, and at least 6,000 died. Residential schools are important for two reasons here: race and gender. Let's start with race. Residential school curriculum undermined Aboriginal identity. One student said,
"They are trying by all means to strip you of who you are as an Aboriginal person."
They also referred to Indigenous peoples as redskins, and there are survivor accounts of how residential schools tried to whiten the red skin of children to bleach baths. Aboriginal people as a race were entirely discriminated against, and their race was seen as a problem that needed fixing. And there's even more to say about gender. A major component to settler colonialism in Canada was enforcing European gender norms into Indigenous communities, largely through residential schools. Boys and girls, as well as brothers and sisters, were completely separated in schools. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission recounts how Lena McKay recalled the expectations for girls and boys there. "And we're not allowed to talk to the boys. One time she came to me, she just about choked me because, my shirt one button was open. She said, 'You want to show yourself to the men? You're boy crazy, your pants crazy,' things like that." Separation of genders had a devastating impact on the children and perpetuated victim blaming and gender-based clothing norms, an attitude still seen today with the victim blaming of sexual assault victims who were asking for it because of their clothing choices. Or, in the case of murdered and missing Indigenous women, some women's professions as sex workers deemed their disappearances unimportant or even unfounded and led to little or no investigation. But back to the separation of boys and girls. Whereas the European settlers had a very clear gender divide between male and female, many Indigenous communities had very different and diverse ideas of gender. So how does this fit into the residential school gender segregation? Walter Williams tells the story of a Navajo two-spirit child who was taken to the Carlisle Indian School in his book, The Spirit in the Flesh. His cousin, Phyllis Rogers, recounts how he came dressed as a girl, so school officials assumed he was female and placed him in the girls' dormitory. Then there was a lice infestation and all the girls were scrubbed down by teachers, so his male genitalia was discovered.
Created using Powtoon.